Welcome. My name is Christopher Merrill, and as the director of the International Writing Program, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event. Creative Matters, a lecture series sponsored by the Office of Vice President for Research. And let me begin by singling out for special thanks Dan Reed, whose support for the arts and humanities is crucial to the life of our community. Creative Matters, which brings together artists, writers, scientists, and thinkers to discuss the creative process, grows out of the Arts Advancement Committee, chaired by Alan McVeigh. Our charge was to synthesize energies, forge connections across disciplines, and spark new ideas in conjunction with the rebuilding of our arts campus. Innovation is thus the theme of Creative Matters, which is the brainchild of David Geer, George de la Peña, Ann Ricketts, and Leslie Weatherhead, who coordinate this wonderful series. For creativity is a defining feature of the University of Iowa, the first higher educational institution in this country to award graduate credit for creative work. And through Creative Matters, we have the chance to broaden our understanding of the mysterious means by which new discoveries are made in the arts, humanities, and sciences. The poet Brewster Giesland argues that, quote, invention in the arts and in thought is a part of the invention of life, and Creative Matters seeks to foster such invention because it is critical to our aesthetic, physical, and spiritual survival. Our speaker tonight, Tobias Wolff, is the author of 4 collections of short fiction, most recently Our Story Begins, New and Selected Stories, the novella The Barracks Thief and the novel Old School, and 2 memoirs, In Pharaohs Army, Memories of the Lost War, and This Boy's Life, which was turned into a feature film starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Robert De Niro, and Ellen Barkin. He has received many honors for his work, including the PEN/Faulkner Award, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and the Academy Award in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And in 2015, President Obama presented him with the National Medal of Arts. He has taught at Syracuse University and now is the Ward W. and Priscilla B. Woods Professor of English Emeritus at Stanford University, where once upon a time he was a Wallace Stegner Fellow. Mr. Wolff's writings are marked by an exquisite attention to detail, a mordant wit, and a relentless determination to see into the heart of things. In This Boy's Life, he writes of his mother's friend, Roy stored his ammunition in a metal box he kept hidden in the closet. As with everything else hidden in the apartment, I knew exactly where to find it. This is true of all of Mr. Wolff's writings in fiction and nonfiction. He knows exactly where to find the goods, which is why his books are so compulsively readable and why we are so fortunate to hear him discuss what he has found along the way. Please join me in welcoming Tobias Wolff to Creative Matters. Toby's going to start with a reading, and then we'll have a little discussion, and then we're going to open it up to questions, okay?
It's great to be back here. I've been to Iowa City many times. I've had, so many of my friends are writers, I'd say most of them came through here. I didn't, so I made a point of coming afterwards. Like now, but I've had great friends here. Frank Conroy, who directed the program for years here, was like my other. I have a brother, Jeffrey, but Frank was like my other brother, and so I have deep ties of love to this place. What I thought I would do was read. I'm working on a novel right now that I'm hoping, I've been working on it for all too long, and I'm hoping to finish it in the next few months after too long. I'm going to read just a brief excerpt from it. The narrator Paul Powers is a student at Berkeley during the war, and is protesting the war, the Vietnam War. And one of the forms his protest takes is acting in a troupe that chooses plays like Mother Courage and Arthur Miller's All My Sons. They call themselves the Frantz Fanon Performative Action Collective. And they have just had a kind of opening night, and they're all excited. And you've all been to cast parties probably at one time or another, and things can get a little out of hand, and everybody's exuberance, and of course theater people are very warm. And he ends up going home with a member of the cast, a woman, which was a bad idea for him since he is already in a relationship with another woman whom he loves and who loves him. And he wakes up convulsed with guilt the next day and decides to go to Charlotte, his love, and confess. We could talk later about whether that's a good idea. But here we go. This is a very short passage from. That evening, I went to Charlotte's room to confess. I recited the lines I'd prepared, but it was hardly necessary. Betrayal was written on my face, in my eyes, the movement of my hands, and I knew it. I could do nothing but watch her take it in and see how her mouth trembled and her own eyes went blind as she struggled to understand what she already knew could not be understood. For what reason could I have for spurning the gift she had made of herself, once I had accepted it? She had not imagined I would ever do that. The man who would do that was not the man she had offered herself to. But who was he then? I fell mute, seeing the depth of the wound I had given her. I knew that nothing I said would reach her now. She was looking at me through a glaze of pain with scouring, almost impersonal curiosity. It was worse than any reproach. Reproach would have been a relief. Yes, and anger and disgust. Then I understood that I had been counting on her to treat me like the fool I wanted to be taken for, to call me names, throw things at me. I'd gone in to play a scene in a glib, whimsical movie with myself as the bumbling rogue who's wandered a bit off the straight and narrow, for which he's perfectly willing to take a few good bumps from a rolling pin and be sent to the doghouse. All, of course, with the understanding that my offense would be thus purged and myself forgiven, welcomed back into loving arms with even greater passion than before. A shallow, safe, conventional script, to be sure, but I already knew how to play it, and I hadn't thought deeply enough to come up with a better one. I was an actor, after all. I was also a Catholic, at least by well-honed instinct. For many years, the soul I no longer believed in had moved to the 4/4 rhythm of transgression, confession, penance, and absolution. Even in contemplating transgression, I had somehow allowed for all the steps to follow. The sheepish wait outside the confessional on Friday afternoon with the other boys, the subdued, murmurous voice I would use with the priest. Yes, Father. 3 times, Father. Yes, Father. Thank you, Father. Then the pressure of the kneeler on my shins as I worked through the prayers he'd assigned me. And at last the lightness of my step as I left the church and entered the world, already feeling a tingle of restlessness for the next adventure. And didn't my church love a sinner after all? A lost sheep, the bigger the better, as long as he's sorry later. During the ceremony of infant baptism, we in the congregation are asked to renew our own vows by rejecting the glamour of evil. But where did we get the idea that evil is glamorous? Who taught us that sin, though no doubt regrettable, is the prelude to forgiveness, to the celebration of a soul's rescue? That the worse the sin, the bigger the bash. Because isn't that our narrative? Before St. Paul was St. Paul, he was Saul of Tarsus, ruthless persecutor of Christians. Knowing the dark, cruel history from which he turned, we hear in his prayers and exhortations an authority we wouldn't grant to some mama's boy who'd sung in the choir, never a drop took, and just couldn't understand why some folks did the things they did. Then there's St. Augustine with his stolen fruit and his mistress. Bunyan's pilgrim, whose journey to salvation would be pretty small beer if it didn't take him through the Slough of Despond, Vanity Fair, the Doubting Castle, and the Valley of Humiliation. Or John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace. When he says, "a wretch like me," you know he's not just touching a rhetorical base. He'd been a wretch all right, and then some, a captain of slave ships. And his hymn would not sound the same to us if we didn't know that. Whereas the redemption litter of our own day has introduced a new grating note, a tone of swaggering pride in having been such a bad boy or bad girl, with implied congratulations to God for having bagged such a trophy. At least the old wretches really knew they were wretches. Tax collectors, publicans, the prodigal son, the primum exemplum of selfish, lazy wastrels. He abandons his father and brother to all the farm work, blows his patrimony on booze and dice and fast women, and ends up sleeping with the pigs. He has second thoughts, naturally. So he writes home, boo-hoo, and of course his father says, "No problem, can't wait." Father stands on a hill overlooking the road so he can see the first signs of his son's return, and runs to meet him. Then throws a party in his honor, slaughters the fatted calf, that world-famous fatted calf, which we wouldn't even know about if he hadn't been slaughtered for the prodigal. Meanwhile, the hard-working brother, who's never had a party, is feeling the death of 1,000 cuts. And when he finally works up the nerve to say something, he's treated like a crybaby. "Get over it," his father tells him. "I see your mopey mug every day. What's to be excited about?" But your brother, that's a different story. He had the gumption to get lost, and now he's found. Drink up. The lesson has not been lost on the rest of us. Who would you rather be? The grumbling drudge, the virtuous stay-at-home whose steadfastness makes him a bore to the very Father he serves? Or the high roller who sees the world from a red convertible, is on familiar terms with the wine steward, keeps amusing company, gets laid by showgirls, and then, after a few hunger pangs and a brief period of reflection on the error of his ways, comes home to a hero's welcome and veal piccata. This is all by way of saying that I went to Charlotte's room that night, not only to confess, but to be forgiven. I may even have nursed a hope of scoring points for honesty and for being desirable to other women, which would prove that I was with her out of choice rather than necessity. But at the very least, I would be forgiven. That was how it worked, in books, on stage and screen, in my mother's kitchen, in the walnut pews of St. Brendan's. I had never not been forgiven after confessing. Until this night. Okay.
And that excerpt points to so many things that are a part of your body of work, from the interest in larger religious matters to the clash between the two brothers. And I thought I might begin by saying you have a fantastic memoir about your service in Vietnam, and now you're choosing to write a novel about somebody who's protesting the war. Other side of the story, I guess, right?
Yeah, I should turn this on, shouldn't I? Let's see. Sorry. Oh, thanks, Leslie, I'm sorry. Thank you. Yes, well, it certainly, when you're writing fiction, you're really imagining yourself in other people's lives, and I had often thought I could just as easily have been on that side of the line. I remember when I was shipping out to Vietnam, they shipped us out through Oakland, what they call the repo depot, the replacement depot there. And there were, and this was 1967 when I went over. I'd been in the Army since '64 at that point. And there were a line of anti-war protesters, but that doesn't really capture what was going on. They were about my age. I think most of them were probably students at Berkeley. And there was actually, though people like to melodramatize everything that happened then, it was actually extremely cordial. And several of us went over to talk to them and had a very, they actually had some apple cider there and some cake and whatnot, and gave us something to eat. And they would have loved to talk us out of going, and actually I would have loved to have been talked out of going. And it was kind of a close thing. I went into San Francisco that night with another guy who was shipping out, a guy I'd known at Fort Bragg, vaguely, not very well. He happened to be on the same manifest I was on, though. So anyway, the two of us went into San Francisco that night, and it was the summer of love, it was '67. And it could not have been clearer to us, the contrast between what people our age were enjoying there and what was going to happen to us at the other end of this airplane ride we were going to take. And the guy I was with, a lieutenant, like me at the time, and his father and stepmother happened to meet us that night, took us out for dinner. They had deliberately come down to meet him. And the father was really interested in talking his son out of going. And indeed, the next morning, he didn't show up for the flight out. Now, he may have taken another flight later or something, but he was absent when they took roll. And I just have often thought about, the people on the other side of that who are motivated by a conviction that, ironically, a lot of us who went over didn't have. I mean, a lot of us I think, felt that we had been caught up in the tide of history, if you will, and were paddling on the surface and powerless against the current, and found ourselves being. So I thought about, and my brother was very much against the war, and most of the friends I'd grown up with, well, not most of them, but a few of the friends I'd grown up with were against it, and I was very conscious in the time leading up to going over there of practicing a kind of willful ignorance about it, because to know too much almost would have disabled whatever kind of motivation I was going to need over there. So it was, but in the years since, I've often thought, I could easily have been on the other side of that. What would that have been like? Who would I have been? How would things have gone differently? And so, fiction is often the realization of those possibilities we see of maybe having been somebody else than who we are. And so that's what kind of led me to that. And it's another way of looking at a kind of hinge moment in our history.
And yet you decided to write about the war originally as a work of nonfiction, although as I understand it, In Pharaoh's Army began as a short story, right?
No, the genesis of In Pharaoh's Army was I had written a short story set in Vietnam, which was something I had originally told myself it was not a subject I was going to write about. And it had been very well written about by Michael Hare and others, and Philip Caputo, and Tim O'Brien, of course. This was before the things they carried. And I just thought, well, I don't know that I have anything to add to this. But of course you always do, because your experience is not like other people's. And mine, in fact, in particular, wasn't like theirs, because I was serving with Vietnamese troops over there. And anyway, I wrote a short story set there just out of, I don't know why, out of a whim. And I liked it when I got done with it, and ended up publishing and including it in a collection. But I also knew all the stuff I'd left out, that it wasn't as true to my experience as I wanted something to be. So I did. I started writing an account of, it wasn't so much a short story, but an account of this crazy day when the sergeant of mine and we were out in the middle of nowhere with this Vietnamese unit. And we used to make raids on the nearest American base to get stakes and basically steal anything that wasn't tied down. That was our main purpose in going there. They were so well equipped and we didn't have anything. And one thing we really wanted was a big TV. We had a generator, thought, well, as long as we're stuck out there, we could watch TV. And so we went down to this place in the Delta, a place called Dongtam, where the 9th Infantry Division was, and we stole this big-ass TV. And so I wrote about that, and then all this stuff comes flooding back, and it just started carrying me back.
As I understand it, it was also to watch Bonanza. Right?
Yeah, they were, yeah, exactly. The Armed Forces Network was going to broadcast Bonanza, which we were fans of. And we had a little TV we watched, and didn't do justice to Ponderosa and that tinny little speaker, the great theme music, totally lost. And Bonanza was going to have that year a special Thanksgiving special, a little longer than the usual. We really wanted to see that right. And so that led to our mission.
I should say that when I picked up Toby at the airport and we started driving home, in no time we were talking about first House of Cards and then The Americans. So I think that there's a certain theme here in gathering inspiration from our TV colleagues, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So as you went to write about the war, and one of the reasons I'm thinking about this is that on Sunday night begins the new Ken Burns documentary, 18 Hours on Vietnam. And it does make me think, what can you render in nonfiction as opposed to what you can render in fiction? So you choose to write this novel about a war protester. This is invention, but here you're remembering. So can you help us to navigate that line between what happened and what could have happened?
Well, I don't know. It was funny. With both memoirs I've written, This Boy's Life and In Pharaoh's Army. I've already described in a sense how I felt that a fictionalized version of my experience over there, when I wrote it in, just fell flat for me and demanded that I go back and treat it more directly and admit that it was my experience and not stand behind the veil of fictionality, if you will. and thus expose myself, which is something, that honestly, this sounds a little disingenuous from someone who's written 2 memoirs, but I'm actually kind of private. And I know. Anyway, so there was a hesitance about that. And also, honestly, I did not play a very glorious part in that war. So it wasn't particularly ignoble. It was pretty ordinary, I guess. But certainly not heroic, let me put it that way. And so, you're always a little wary of exposure. And the same thing happened to me when I was writing This Boy's Life. I had kind of written down some memories of growing up with my mother, which I had thought to use in a novel. And the funny thing was, when I was trying to write that novel, whenever I would fictionalize, it would just go flat. All the air would go out of it. And finally, I was kind of compelled to admit to myself that what this material, to speak mystically, wanted to be treated like was itself. The actual material of experience. And so it required going back and saying, because you got to know whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction. You really do. And you can certainly draw on your experience for your fiction. I was going to read part of this novel. It was all going to go too long. This novel, Old School, which does draw from my experience, but is not a memoir. I invented a great deal of it and was consciously inventing around my experience in the writing of it. That is a novel. And once you put the word novel on the cover of what you're writing, the world is your oyster. You have complete freedom. You are irreproachable. It's different when you put the word memoir on the cover, though. Then you have an understanding with people and it's just amazing how cavalierly that can be treated. You think of, obviously James Fry and all that, but I've noticed, for example, that guy Benjamin Wilkomirski, who wrote this book, Fragments, memoirs supposedly about growing up in Auschwitz as a toddler and being kind of protected by the women in the women's barracks there. And it turned out to be totally bogus. A woman named Misha de Fonseca wrote a memoir about her parents being taken off to a camp during World War II when she was a toddler, and that she kind of toddled into the forest and was adopted and raised by a pack of wolves. And sometimes we have only ourselves to blame for our shock, but this was exposed to be, believe it or not, untrue. And there have been a number of those, and I laugh, but how did anybody believe it and all that sort of thing. But the truth is, that does a certain damage because, say in the case of these books, there's a very robust Holocaust denial industry, and it feeds that. People could say, see, it's always been this. It's these myths, these things people make up. And actually, I could name more of these kind of fake Holocaust memoirs. And so it's not, to me, an innocent thing to call what is purely fiction a memoir. I think that at the worst end of it, like those examples, you can do, I think, real harm.
And there is a family history here. Your father was a compulsive storyteller. Your older brother Jeffrey wrote a dazzling memoir about him, Duke of Deception.
Absolutely.
So it's not just a theoretical issue for you.
No, it isn't. And my father was, I suppose the kind word would be a fabulist. I just actually had a funny little kind of exchange. One of my father's legacies was, to this day, my brother wears this beautiful, heavy gold ring with a coat of arms on it, a seal, like you do in the wax. And, I mean, he knows the story behind it. It's a beautiful piece of jewelry. That's why he wears it, not because, because it establishes our kinship with John of Gaunt or anything. But that coat of arms was invented by my father. And apparently he was, so he, with his little Latin, created a motto, like aristocrats have. And it was supposed to mean never a backward look. I actually he also did a kind of picture like you hang on the wall of the coat of arms. And I showed this to a friend of mine, a woman who's a classicist at Stanford, and asked her to translate it. And it means not a trace left behind. And she broke it all down for me grammatically.
Sounds like the beginning of the next book, doesn't it?
Yeah, right. The title.
It's also, I find it interesting, John le Carré has a new novel out. His father was a fabulist.
Yes, he was. Ronnie, he was an amazing character.
Yeah, so do you think this is a necessary ingredient for becoming a literary artist?
No, really, I don't. No, I don't. I mean, yeah, writers are often, produced. I mean, they come from every kind of experience, really. So I would never generalize. But somebody did say once, I think, who was it, that, what did it say? Like a terrible childhood is the best gift a family can give a writer. And well, at least it does this. It takes away the element of guilt in writing about your family. Right? And my mom once said, somebody asked her about her feeling about the fact that my brother and I had both written memoirs in which she appears. And I mean, she was wonderful. But she made bad choices here and there, and especially with men. But anyway, somebody was interviewing her about it was actually after my book came out, and she said, she vouched for the accuracy of the book, and then said, but I have to say, if I'd known that both of my sons were going to be writers, I might have lived a little differently. And who wouldn't? In fact, my daughter writes, and she showed me a story that she wrote when she was an undergraduate once, in which she described a man wearing a shirt that he did not know was too young for him. And I knew the shirt. And I thought, oh, okay, this is karma. This is what karma means. Now I know.
It's also true that your mother was not happy to see her name changed in the movie version because there were the love scenes with Robert De Niro, right?
Well, the thing was, I got this script before they shot it, and I made them change my mother's name in the movie because she was then this, very respectable little old lady, and she was chairman of the League of Women Voters in Volusia County, Florida, and she was in the garden club there and everything. And actually, those sex scenes don't even appear in my book. My mother, thank God, did not describe her sex life to me, And I wouldn't have presumed to write about it, but you know, here they had Ellen Barkin and Robert De Niro. What are they going to do? So they wrote them in, and I have to say I thought that she would be mortified by them, so I had them change her name, and then she went to see me to see the opening, the premiere of the movie with me, and boy, a couple of times her hand just came down on me like this during the movie. And at the end of it, I turned to her and said, why did they change my name? And I said, the penny hadn't quite dropped yet. And I said, oh, I had them do that. You had them do that? Why? And I said, well, because of those sex scenes. And she said, but they're with Robert De Niro. It's true. And she wasn't an ironist, my mother.
When you were writing This Boy's Life as a memoir, were you thinking in any ways about how your brother had treated your father in his memoir? Was that a guide in any way or a spur? How did that work?
Well, actually, when my brother's memoir came out, which was many years before I wrote one, and in fact, I almost felt when I read his book, which I really love, good, that's taken care of. Family stories covered, not something I don't have to do. And then in this strange way, I found myself doing it. But we had grown up, he grew up with my father, and I grew up with my mother at the other end of the country, and both of us in completely different circumstances. We had completely different growings up. And I didn't see my brother from the time I was about 4 until I was 16. And so we had very discrete experiences of growing up. And so there wasn't, and I didn't know my father very well. I did have some, I did have some dealings with him, which I did put in the book, of course. And actually, oddly enough, I got to know him much better, or a little bit better, on my way to Vietnam and on the way back, because he was living in California then, and I stopped and spent time with him both times. But we were not, I just didn't grow up with him. So, yeah, they were very different, and he saw my mother differently. And than I did, because he's 8 years older than I am, so he knew, he'd grown up much more with my mother before they split, and he went off to school and all that, and knew her well, and had a certain vision of her. But that was a lesson to me, because his vision of her was not my vision of her, because his experience of her was not my experience of her. And that's really the way it works, isn't it? I mean, when we talk about what someone is like, part of what we're describing that person's reaction to us. That's how we judge what they're like. And they may be very different with somebody else. And so we're apt to disagree about what someone is like based on what we're like and how we relate to them. It isn't possible to make an objective assessment of somebody in that way.
So when you're creating a character, are you conscious of that larger view of the ways in which their reactions to one character or another might shape who they are and how they should appear on the page?
If so, it's instinctive rather than calculated at this point. There's a lot, when we talk about writing, when we talk about something we've written, we give ourselves credit for decisions. In fact, what we're doing is kind of reverse engineering, and what was probably the product of just a momentary thought or whim, in this way. Think of the last stanza of that great Frost poem, The Road Not Taken, which is always taught as a kind of hymn to American or to the individual doing the hard thing and coming up, on top of things that way. He says at the end, you remember, he describes being out taking a walk and trying to figure out which of two paths to take. And what we always forget in that poem is a line earlier that says, both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Got to remember that. When that poem gets taught, the teachers always leave that line out. And they go to the ending, which goes, I shall be telling this with a sigh someday ages and ages hence, how two roads met in a wood and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Well, it's not about taking the hard road and that making a difference. It's about the way we lie later on or invent later on reasons for something that we have done and give ourselves credit for like valorous decisions or brilliant ideas, when in fact we have ended up somewhere because of decisions taken at the spur of the moment, on a whim, because we didn't eat enough that morning, whatever. And I just think Frost just captures that so beautifully in that poem. Even the way that the verse enacts that kind of self-congratulations, how two roads met in a wood and I took the one less. The way he repeats that, it's just great. Anyway.
That's like your character on his way to the confessional. Right?
Yeah, there you go.
Before we open it up to the audience, I wanted just to say you're here as well for Dennis Johnson's memorial tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock in McBride. Do you have anything you want to say about him by way of preempting your talk tomorrow?
Well, Dennis Johnson, when Chris and I were driving over here today, Dennis is one of the few people of whom, without any reservation at all, I would use the word genius. The work, it has genius and it's visionary. He's really one of the great American writers. If you haven't read his work, read Angels, this wonderful early novel of his. Read his great collection of linked stories, Jesus' Son. His novel about Vietnam, Tree of Smoke, which, and he's a wonderful poet. The Incognito Lounge is just one of my favorite books of poems. I'm actually going to quote from a couple of poems when we talk about Dennis tomorrow. But he was a dear man and a friend from a long time back, and also, he was you have a connection with him here. He was in Iowa City for years and years, both as a student at the university and later as a professor here for some time. So he had deep ties here, but he was one of the great writers of his time, no question about it.
So his great novel about Vietnam,
Tree of Smoke.
Does it ring true for you?
Well, it's vision. I mean, one of the subplots in this long novel of his has to do with people doing primate research during the war, and he did great research himself in order to write that section. And I mean, so actually, it was revelatory to me. It wasn't like reading something I recognized. It was like discovering stuff I didn't know, but that rang true.
Well, we find that in all of your work too.
Well, thank you.
Let's open it up for questions. We're not going to have a mic go around, so speak loudly and I'll repeat it so that we can get it on tape. Yeah.
Do you talk writing with other writers?
The question is, do you talk writing with other writers?
We talk. I mean, for example, Chris and I were talking about writing on the way over here. What we did not do, and what we did not talk. Chris did not talk about his own work, and I did not talk about my own work. We talked about other people's work, and we talked about things we admired in it. And if we'd spent a little longer together in the car, we would have started talking about writers whose work we didn't like and what's wrong with it. But
Actually, we did start down that path.
did we? Oh, okay. There we are. We just needed another 10 minutes. We'd have had him on a dissecting table. I mean, we live in words. We're constantly trying to find the right form for those words and those stories. And you're just making decisions, and you draw, your kind of arsenal of possibilities from the work of other people. I mean, you don't spring full blown from Zeus's forehead. You're the sum of all the things you've read, and the more you read, the better your decisions are apt to be when you're confronting that page. So, yeah, I mean, we're obsessed people, so we talk about what obsesses us. But it's really interesting. With a few exceptions, and those, frankly, are writers I avoid, you don't talk about your own work. And another thing you don't do for your own sake is talk about work in progress. The genie just goes out of the bottle somehow when you do that.
Other questions? Yeah.
So can I ask about the work in progress that
Well, it's far enough along that I can say a few things about it. Okay.
it's fiction, and it's based on the fact that you want to go back to that time in Vietnam, but from the other perspective. And I'm wondering how much of what has happened with Iraq and stuff like that affected the writing of this story.
Yeah.
So did everybody hear the question? How much did Iraq and things that have happened since Vietnam affect the writing of this novel?
No, it's very affected by that. In fact, the actual present time of the novel is just after we've gone into Iraq, and he's looking back. He's somebody I could have been. I've always liked Updike's rabbit novels. And I think one of the things that gives that character, Rabbit Angstrom, such authenticity for me is that really is the person that Updike could have been if he hadn't been quite so smart. And because in other ways, I think he's a lot like Updike. I think Updike thinks that Rabbit is a lot like Updike. And that is the other person that he could have turned into. And in a way, the guy I'm writing about right now is somebody I could have turned into and who could have followed, I could have followed the path that this guy's on, which is not altogether a good path, I have to say. But, he's in some confusion as he's telling this story, let me put it that way, at a time in his life when you hope you're not in confusion. I don't know. You don't have a story without problems, do you?
So you were saying like fiction is so different from memoirs because memoirs you try to stay true, and in fiction you can invent whatever. But then you say that in like Robert Frost, he's actually making up a life of his decisions. So is memoir also a way of finding the fiction in your truth or the truth in your fiction? Do I make sense?
Well,
Repeat that. The question is the memoir a way of finding the fiction in your life, or fiction the way to find the truth in your life?
Yeah, yes, fiction is a way to find, that's the great irony of fiction is that in some ways it's better suited to get at the truth than what we call nonfiction. It really takes some resolve to, if you're writing personally, to avoid the traps of prettying up the picture of yourself, or conversely, making so darkening the picture of yourself that falsifies it too. There are all those kind of pitfalls which you really don't have so much when you're writing fiction. And I'm not saying it's easier to get at the truth, but there are impediments to the truth in writing what we call nonfiction that are formidable, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have two short questions. What happens when you walk the thin line of autofiction, where you're actually writing a personal narrative, not like prettifying or darkening, but still having to fill in blanks with fiction? You know, what about that very particular, you know, intermediary genre that isn't spoken about a lot? That was my first question. And the second is, like, as a memoirist, well, you're from a larger society, you know, whereas I like from a small face-to-face society, but I kind of wondered what happens in your context when you write about the nasty stuff, you know, the stuff that's true, that's not beautiful, but that's important to your experience. How do people react?
I'll start with the second one. How do people react when you write the difficult stuff? And I assume you mean when you're writing nonfiction, and you're dealing with that sort of thing. They don't like it. No, they really don't like it. No, people. I honestly, my only way of giving myself a pass to write in memoir form, which necessarily involves bringing other people in, because you're not in solitary confinement, right? And all the important things that happen to you happen in relationship with other people. And sometimes those are fraught, those relationships, and at least difficult. And I was going to say that I've never written a book to hurt anybody. That isn't entirely true. Let me say that I didn't mind that someone had his feelings hurt, a particular person, by something that I wrote, but that wasn't my primary motive in doing it. But I told the truth, and it was an important, for me, necessary truth to tell. You know, I guess I could have said to him if he complained, well, you should have lived your life differently, like my mother said, you know? But that's hard. For one thing, none of us likes to have someone else take command of our story. We all have a proprietary feeling about our own story. When we see it show up in someone else's hands, it's challenging for us to accept that. Also, because of the way memory works, that makes it even more difficult, because the memories are going to be different. For this reason, if no other, in your memories, you are the main character in all of your memories. Isn't that amazing? And but in your sister's memory, she's the main character. So, like when you're talking or writing about something that happened in the past, and your sister's listening to you or reading it, and you're thinking, wait a minute, that was an event that I was at the center of, and I only have a cameo, or you know, a walk-up, and because that's the way our memories work, right? And so we're always going to be memories are always in contest with each other in that way. And, you know, I allow for that when I read memoirs. I know that they're going to be very subjective and perhaps self-serving, unconsciously so, or maybe even consciously so. But, yeah, there's no way to escape that kind of friction.